They'll be debating two competing proposals to fund the federal government for the remainder of fiscal year 2011, which ends on September 30th. Voting is scheduled for 3 p.m. Eastern. And now live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Mr. President, the amendment I introduced on Friday cuts $51 billion from the discretionary spending request submitted by the President for FY 2011. If this amendment were agreed to as written, it would mean that we would appropriate $51 billion less than the President felt was necessary for the government to carry out its duties. Mr. President, I do not agree with every item in this President or any President request on this budget, but I also know that the President's budget request did not contain $51 billion in frivolous or wasteful spending. The cuts necessary to reach the $51 billion level required difficult choices. This amendment makes real cuts to real programs. Tens of thousands of Americans will feel the direct impact of the proposed cuts. But the cuts included in this amendment are based on hearings, testimony, and a thorough analysis of the current needs of every agency and department that the committee funds. By contrast, the Republicans in the House have thrown together a proposal based not on budgets, not on hearings, not on the demonstrated needs of agencies and departments, but rather based on the campaign promise to reduce spending by $100 billion. H.R. 1 shows clearly what happens when you write a bill based not on analysis, but on campaign speeches. Therefore, today the Senate finds itself responding to draconian cuts that would lead to furloughs, disrupt the delivery of government agencies and services, and harm America's children, our students, our working class, and our seniors. An estimated 700,000 jobs would be lost. All of this pain delivered in the name of deficit reduction and the growing the economy. Yet, Mr. President, the facts are clear. This is the wrong direction for our nation. Mr. President, we face our current fiscal situation primarily because of falling revenues brought about by an unpaid for tax cuts, especially for the wealthiest Americans, and because of ever-rising entitlement costs. Every nonpartisan report on finding a solution to our current fiscal crisis stresses the need for a comprehensive solution. A solution that includes cuts in discretionary spending, both defense and non-defense, as well as cuts in entitlement spending, and yes, the need for additional revenues. Just yesterday, the New York Times published a story about the efforts of the junior senator from Virginia and the senior senator from Georgia to honestly examine what it will take to solve our fiscal challenges. According to that story, even if Congress cut discretionary spending to zero, the senior senator from Georgia was quoted as saying, we still could not solve the problem. Mr. President, I could not agree more. The solution to deficit reduction will not come from huge cuts to a small portion of the federal budget, but that is what the House is proposing. What H.R. 1 will do instead is jeopardize the economic recovery we are beginning to see. Mr. President, this Democratic alternative attempts to make the best of a very bad situation. The top-line numbers tell the story. In this amendment, we are $23 billion below the President's request for non-security spending. and we are $28 billion below his original request for spending related to our nation's security. For the Department of Defense alone, we have reduced spending by $19.4 billion, including a reduction of $2.1 billion for military construction and $17.3 billion for the rest of the Defense Department. At this level, the bill is nearly $3 billion below the amounts proposed by the House for these activities. The recommended amounts will cover our defense requirements in this constrained fiscal environment. However, my colleagues should all understand that with our troops still serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is not the time to be looking to defense for additional reductions. Mr. President, I fear that not all members understand the depth of the cuts that we have made to take out to get $51 billion under the request. They should be advised, for example, that the Senate amendment cuts $355 million for state and local law enforcement grants. This will result in some 1,400 fewer local and tribal law enforcement and criminal justice jobs. In addition, the amendment cuts $526 million from FBI salaries and expenses. These cuts will halt new national security enhancements intended to improve our intelligence and counterterrorism capabilities to protect U.S. information and technology networks from cyber attacks and to assist in litigation of intelligence and terrorism cases. This amendment cuts science funding by $573 million at the National Science Foundation and by $165 million at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And as a result, Mr. President, the nation will lose opportunities for promising research in emerging fields like cybersecurity and nanotechnology. Instead of taking the lead as we have always done, we will slow down, allowing the rest of the world to catch up. When it comes to the critical area of education, the Senate amendment eliminates 17 individual education programs totaling $370 million. It cuts all federal funding specifically targeted to education technology, gifted and talented instruction, and family literacy. And, Mr. President, the list goes on and on. But as significant as these cuts are, they stand in strong contrast to the House Republican bill, which includes such severe measures that the bill would undermine our security, endanger our economy, while costing hundreds of thousands of American jobs. H.R. 1 would cut transit security grants by 66%, despite the fact that there have been over 1,300 attacks, killing or injuring over 18,000 people worldwide on trains and subways over the last 7 years. The Senate bill would maintain the fiscal year 2010 enacted level of $300 million. The House Republicans see our cuts discretionary funding for community health centers by $1 billion compared to the FY10 enacted level. This cut would prevent any new clinic from opening. It will eliminate funding for 127 clinics currently operating in 38 states and reduce current services at another 1,096 centers across the country. More than 2.8 million people will likely lose access to their current primary care provider, and over 5,000 health center staff would lose their jobs. The Senate bill restores the $1 billion cut preserving both the vital services being provided today and the planned expansion of centers estimated to treat over 7.5 million new patients this year. The House CR would eliminate all funding for the Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery TIGER grant program. TIGER grants are highly competitive and fund transportation projects that make a significant contribution to the nation, a region, or metropolitan area. The House proposal would take funding away from 75 projects in 40 states across the country. Based on information from the Transportation Department, cutting a total of $1.2 billion from the TIGER program will put 33,360 jobs at risk. H.R. 1 cuts funding for the Social Security Administration administrative expenses by $125 million below the 2010 level. This would cause the SSA to freeze hiring across the agency and possibly furlough employees at a time when the number of Americans filing for disability and retirement benefits is at record levels. The Senate bill, by contrast, provides $600 million more than the House Republican proposal. Compared to the House CR, it will allow SSA to process about 300,000 more initial disability claims and 150,000 more disability hearings and prevent delays in new beneficiaries receiving their retirement benefits. The House bill slashes Title I education funding by nearly $700 million, meaning 2,400 schools serving 1 million disadvantaged students would lose funding, and approximately 10,000 teachers and aides would lose their jobs. At a time when schools across the nation are already struggling with budget cuts, the Title I grants program serves as the foundation of federal assistance to elementary and secondary schools across the country, providing financial assistance to more than 90% of our nation's school districts. Finally, with regard to our nation's security interests, the devastating funding cuts in H.R. 1 undermine our ability to stabilize Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, and to support General Petraeus' counterinsurgency strategy. H.R. 1 provides $5.71 billion for Economic Support Fund, a 27% cut from the FY 2011 request. As both Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton have made clear in repeating testimony before Congress, cuts of this magnitude will seriously impede efforts to stabilize Afghanistan and to transition responsibility for U.S. operations in Iraq from military to civilian. Mr. President, there are many more examples of damage that would come from should H.R. 1 be enacted into law, which is why the President has promised a veto, and why I know my Democratic colleagues will reject it when it comes up to a vote. The Senate amendment that I offer takes a responsible approach to funding the government for the remainder of the fiscal year, making difficult decisions, but also ensuring minimal disruptions to the economic recovery. Mr. President, we're now almost halfway through FY 2011. And if we are to have any chance of avoiding another series of continuing resolutions for FY 2012, we simply must finish our work on the current year and move past this issue. Therefore, Mr. President, I strongly encourage my colleagues to support my amendment as a prudent alternative to the House measure. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, I start by asking unanimous consent that speakers on the Republican side be limited to 10 minutes each, with Senator Coburn controlling up to 25 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, come to speak on the two proposals, the Democrat proposal and the Republican proposal from the House, known as H.R. 1. I'm going to reluctantly support H.R. 1. It reduces government spending by about $61 billion below last year's levels. The reason I'm reluctantly supporting it is because I don't think it goes far enough. We've heard the other side rail that the cuts are too large. But let me just, a few quotes here. This is from Admiral Mike Mullen, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm just going to read the yellow portion here. He said that I believe that our debt is the greatest threat to our national security. Well, we know that our national debt is over $14 trillion now. This year, we're spending in excess of what we take in, over almost $1.6 trillion. And all we're talking about in that House bill that got sent over here is reducing that amount by $61 billion, a very paltry amount. A few other quotes that I want to talk about here. This is from Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. He said February 17th, it is an excessively high interest burden, talking about our debt. He said it's unsustainable. With the President's plan, even if Congress were to enact it, and even if Congress were to hold to it and reduce those deficits as a percentage of GDP over the next 5 years, and this is the important part, we would still be left with a very large interest burden and unsustainable obligations over time. That's the Secretary of Treasury. He also said that our deficits are too high. They are unsustainable. I think everybody agrees. They're unsustainable. And he said if left unaddressed, these deficits will hurt economic growth and make us weaker as a nation. Well, the bills that we have before us, one bill starts to address it. The other bill virtually ignores the deficit. Next quote, this from the President himself. He says, what my budget does is to put forward some tough choices, some significant spending cuts, so that by the middle of this decade, our annual spending will match our annual revenues. He said, we will not be adding more to the national debt. It is absolutely incredible that the President could make such a comment by looking at his budget. His budget takes us from $14 trillion in debt to $27 trillion in debt over the next decade. Almost doubles the national debt. And he says we're going to be living within our means. Here's a graph of that. Right in 2010, we were about $13.5 trillion. You see, over the decade, we go up further, further, further. Down here, 2021, 26.3. This is virtually a doubling of our national debt. That's why when Timothy Geithner said it's unsustainable, our Secretary of the Treasury, appointed by President Obama, he says it's unsustainable. We all agree it's unsustainable. So when are we going to get spending under control? We have to quit spending money that we do not have because we're bankrupting the very future of America. I want to quote just a few of the senators from the other side of the aisle. Senator Joe Manchin said, the most powerful person in these negotiations, our President, has failed to lead on this debate or offer a serious proposal for spending cuts. He also said, the Democratic bill, the other alternative, utterly ignores our fiscal reality, that our nation is badly in debt and spending at absolutely unsustainable and out-of-control levels. We must turn our financial ship around, but the Senate proposal continues to sail forward as if there's no storm on the horizon. That's a quote from one of our Democratic colleagues here from West Virginia. The bill that has been proposed by the Democrat majority fails to understand that there is a fiscal crisis in this country, and it is a problem of spending. Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri said, another Democrat, "I feel strongly that the cuts are not large enough," talking about this bill. Senator Mark Warner said, "At some point we need to send some kind of a shock wave across the federal government that this time we really mean it." He was talking about spending cuts. He was talking about getting serious about deficit reduction. Well, Mr. President, the House bill doesn't do enough, but at least it's headed more in the right direction about getting spending under control. While I might not agree with every one of the spending cuts in it, the direction it is going is the right direction, what we need to do as a Congress. The bill that the majority has put before us is really showing a lack of understanding of how serious this deficit and this debt, how serious of an issue that this is for our country. Now, a few other things that I want to talk about. I want to put all of this deficit reduction that this is being called into some sort of context. This year, the Congressional Budget Office says that we're going to spend $1.5 trillion more than what we take in. That's what the deficit is this year. According to the President, it's over $1.6 trillion. Those are their estimates. The bottom line is we are spending about 40 cents more per dollar than what we take in. Now, these spending proposals that we have before us, this is how much the deficit is. The House bill will reduce that deficit by this tiny slice of the pie. The Democrat majority's bill will reduce it by this little tiny slice of the pie right here. So the House bill is a small slice, but at least it's a larger slice than what the Democrat majority has put out. The bottom line is this is pathetic, and this will do nothing to actually put us on a sustainable fiscal path where we can start living within our means and quit spending money that we do not have. The House bill itself is actually just a 4% reduction in the amount of money that we're borrowing. It's just a 4% reduction. If you think about it, this year, since we're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar that we spend, to put that in terms that maybe a family would understand, it would be like a family making $60,000 a year, and yet it's going to spend $100,000. Well, any family in America would understand that that's unsustainable. You couldn't continue along that path. And if that same family was to decrease their spending habits by the same amount that the Democrats have proposed, out of that $100,000, they would reduce their spending habits by $168. That's all. That's how pathetic this spending reduction is by the other side. We have to get serious. Recently, Senator Coburn requested a General Accountability Office report that came back and said they identified over $100 billion in duplicative and wasteful spending programs. $100 billion per year in wasteful and duplicative spending programs. This GAO report underscores the great negligence of the federal government when it comes to managing hard-earned taxpayer dollars. Let me just give you a couple of facts from that report. It said that the government spends $18 billion on 47 different job training programs. And yet the President even requested another $400 million for a new program that will replicate proven strategies to develop even more job training programs. You know how many of these job training programs are measured for effectiveness out of the 47? Zero. are measured for effectiveness. 0. And yet we're going to create more instead of eliminating a lot of the programs and doing our proper oversight that this Congress should be doing. There are 80 programs providing transportation to disadvantaged persons in 8 different departments. The GAO found that $2 billion in costs for just 29 of these programs, but the extent of fragmentation in this area was unable to identify total cost for the other 51 programs. In other words, they couldn't even identify what the total costs were for these other programs. That's how messed up it is. The U.S. government also spends about $63 billion on 18 different domestic food and nutrition programs and about $3 billion on 20 homelessness programs. And the report notes, and I'm quoting, "This can create unnecessary work for both providers and applicants and may result in the use of more administrative resources than needed." Let me translate that. That means we have too much bureaucracy and too much wasteful spending, so the money doesn't actually get to the people it's intended to help. It gets spent in the bureaucracy. We also have another almost $60 billion spent on over 100 duplicated and fragmented surface transportation programs, 100 of them. And so while I'm troubled that the $61 billion from the House just isn't enough to tackle the problem, I am astounded by what the other side of the aisle has done. It also continues many of the wasteful programs that we talk about. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting has come under fire. Obviously, NPR, this morning, their CEO resigned. We've seen the controversies there. But their bill also spends tens of millions of dollars to help unions organize overseas, not even in America. Are unions helping unions organize overseas? Is that what we want to be doing with American taxpayer dollars? Well, today's vote are a choice between modest progress and making the problem.
The senator has, the senator has used 10 minutes.
I'd ask for an additional 1 minute.
Without objection.
The House bill needs to be the floor for what we accomplish out of this process. And as I said, the House bill isn't nearly enough, and we can't allow this process to capture a modest improvement in the name of compromise by watering it down to a complete abdication of leadership. The stakes are really just too high. So today, I will be reluctantly supporting H.R. 1, the House bill, which cuts $61 billion from last year's spending. It's a step in the right direction, a modest step. The other side has put forward a proposal that should be rejected out of hand because it is completely inadequate. It keeps us spending money we do not have. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New York.
I ask consent to speak up to two minutes and for Senator Leahy to be recognized following my remarks for 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, and I wouldn't mind the chart from my friend from Nevada staying up because it makes my point that I'll make in a minute. In a few hours, the Senate will hold an up or down vote on H.R. 1, the House Republicans' scorched earth spending proposal that counts among its casualties such critical priorities as border security, cancer research, and food safety inspectors. The House GOP proposal is a Trojan horse, and we will not be fooled by it. It speaks in the name of deficit reduction, but the dirty little secret about the Republican spending plan is that once the dust is settled, it would only decrease the deficit by $5 billion in fiscal year 2011. When you look at the CBO score of the continuing resolution we're operating under and compare that to the House spending bill, the difference by CBO in budget outlays only amounts to $5 billion in fiscal year 2011. So we're talking about a difference of $1.36 trillion in budget outlays under the current CR versus $1.355 trillion in budget outlays under the Republican proposal, much as my colleague from Nevada's chart has shown. In other words, all of the cuts that the Republicans are currently proposing will shave a grand total of 0.3% from the deficit. Some might say, well, it's a start, but in relation to the damage these cuts will do, it's a meaningless start. The cuts to domestic discretionary will do nothing to create jobs or spur short-term economic growth. In fact, the reverse is true. As numerous independent economists point out, we will see a reduction in economic growth almost immediately if H.R. 1 is enacted. And these cuts will harm our ability to prepare for the future because they gut the very priorities we need to be investing in to help our economy grow. Education.
The Senator's time has expired.
With unanimous consent, I be given 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
Energy investment, technology, and infrastructure. So if all these cuts won't improve the economy in the near term and won't help economic growth in the longer term and won't cut the deficit, then exactly what will they do? They'll satisfy a very small but vocal segment of the Republican Party. That's all. So, Mr. President, it's time for a reset. This morning I called for a reset of this budget debate. I think it's important that after today's votes, both sides in the debate take a deep, collective breath. We should all take stock of how the discussion up to now has become distorted and seek to reset the terms of the debate. It may not happen tomorrow, but in the coming weeks, as negotiations led by the White House reconvene, we should approach the talks with fresh eyes and a new mindset. Rather than continuing the fixation on domestic discretionary cuts, which at the same time do huge damage and cut the deficit very little just because of the way they are spent, the next offer and counteroffer should include mandatory cuts and revenue raisers like oil royalties into the mix. We will only put a dent in the deficit through shared sacrifice. Focusing simply on domestic discretionary and even leaving out the military will not achieve our goal of deficit reduction, including mandatory cuts and revenue raisers like oil royalties will. The bottom line is this: the blame for the current breakdown in budget negotiations rests with our failure to think big. A bipartisan compromise simply will not be found in discretionary spending cuts alone. We must broaden the playing field. The solution will only come from putting other kinds of cuts as well as revenue enhancements on the table. Doing this will also set the table for the larger budget discussions still to come. I see my colleague from Vermont is here, so I'm ready to yield the floor to him.
I appreciate that, but I think what they're going to do is try to go back and forth on the
well, I yield the floor in any case, Mr.
routine,
President.
so Senator Sessions go, but I appreciate the courtesy for the Senator from New York, and I would yield with the and with consent that I then be recognized at the end of the Senator from Alabama's speech.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I thank the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee and congratulate him on a very successful patent bill that I passed with an overwhelming vote. I was pleased to work with him on that as a partner for 2 years and when I was ranking member of that committee, and I think it's a good day. Mr. President, we'll soon be moving toward a vote on the continuing resolution. There are apparently going to be 2 options given to us, and the question I would pose to our colleagues and to the American people is, do we have to do something, or can we do nothing? Is nothing an option? Because that's what the Democratic proposal is, nothing, zero, nada. So we had in the Budget Committee, of which I'm the ranking member now, the testimony yesterday of Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, Senator Simpson, Republican from Wyoming, Mr. Bowles, President Clinton's chief of staff, and a well-known business and Democratic leader. And this is what they told us yesterday in their written statement. Both of them put this in to us. We believe that if we do not take decisive action, our nation faces the most predictable economic crisis in history. Close quote. They have spent months wrestling with these numbers. They reached a majority of the members voted for the reforms they proposed, and they gave a lot of time and effort to it. I didn't think they went far enough in some of the areas, but I would say they made a real significant attempt to deal with the crisis we face. And in their testimony yesterday, they went even further. What do we mean, a crisis? We had a crisis in 2007 that put us in the deepest recession we've had in decades. Greece has had a crisis. That's the kind of thing they're talking about. 40% of every dollar we spend is borrowed. And Senator Conrad, our chairman, distinguished Democratic leader, asked them, what happens in your judgment to the United States if we fail to get an agreement in the range of what the Commission concluded is necessary? The Commission proposes a $4 trillion reduction in our deficit spending over the next 10 years. Should be more. That's what they proposed. President Obama's budget says it reduces it by $1 trillion. But when the CBO scores it, they're going to find it's filled with gimmicks, and there will not be any reduction, I predict, in the deficit in the Obama budget, which is really, really disappointing. It's a do-nothing-about-the-debt problem budget. Mr. Bowles, so what's going to happen? Mr. Bowles, quote, this problem is going to happen. It is a problem. We're going to have to face up in maybe 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, close quote. And Mr. Simpson, he commented, I think it will come before 2 years. We're talking about a crisis. I'm just saying at some point, I think within a year, at the end of a year, if the people who hold our debt just thought you're playing with fluff, 5–6% of this whole, they're going to say, I want some money for my paper. If there's anything money guys love, it's money. And money guys, when they start losing money, panic. And let me tell you, they will. It won't matter what the government does. They'll say, I want my money. I've got a better place for it. Just saying for me, it won't be a year before we have a crisis. Well, this is a serious matter. It's not a do-nothing circumstance. So we have a simple choice to make today. Do we take a step, even a small step, that sends a signal to the world that we tend to take action to prevent the crisis, not act after a disaster hits? Or we could do nothing, as the Democratic proposal is. The Republican proposal will immediately lower spending by $61 billion for the rest of the year. That's a reduction of about 6% of the discretionary spending budget. Most states, cities, and counties in America have had bigger reductions than that. And they're still here. They haven't ceased to exist, and we're not going to cease to exist if we reduce spending 6%, but it'll make a difference. That amounts to 4% of the total debt. And as I will show in a moment, Mr. President, it means a lot more than that. The Democratic proposal proposes $6 billion, but it's really clearly only a $4 billion reduction. That's less than 1/2 of 1% reduction in the discretionary spending budget. Less than 1/2 of 1%. Now, this $61 billion is not going to break us. GAO recently found that the government spends $18 billion on 47 different job training programs. 47 different job training programs. We don't have any ability to save money and do more with less in this country? No business would run the way we run the United States government. And this is just one of the typical kind of duplication and waste that goes on in our government. We are living in a fantasy world if we think we can't find $61 billion to reduce out of more than $1 trillion in a discretionary budget. Under President Obama, the discretionary spending increased 24% in the last 2 years. It's already gone up 24%. What do you mean we can't take a 6% reduction? We're facing a crisis, a debt crisis. Families across the country are trimming their budgets. They're doing so every day. Washington just keeps on growing and spending and growing. We had the Education Secretary into the Budget Committee last week. They proposed an 11% increase in education spending this year. 11. Energy was in, 9.5% increase this next year for energy, they say. And hold your hat, the Secretary of Transportation was in and proposes a 62% transportation budget increase. So this is where we were, over $3 trillion, and we jumped now to $3.7 trillion. Well, how much money do we, so that's a 24% increase. I'm not making these numbers up. Well, what about the deficit numbers? This year we spend $3.7 trillion, maybe $3.8 trillion. Want to know how much our revenue is this year? 2.2. I know this is unbelievable. American people probably just cannot imagine that we're spending 3.8 and taking in 2.2. But it is true. 40 cents of every dollar that we spend is borrowed. This is why Mr. Bowles and Mr. Simpson and every economist that's ever testified has said we're on an unsustainable path, a path that cannot be continued. And we need to take action now. This isn't enough, but it's a step. I think it sends a word to the world financial markets, the bond vigilantes, that maybe the United States is, in fact, on the road to doing something about the spending that we're in. Our debt will soon be larger than the economy. It will exceed 100% of GDP by the end of this fiscal year. Amazingly surging debt load for the whole country. We cannot keep spending what we don't have, borrowing what we cannot pay back. We cannot do this. Our crushing debt burden is like an anchor dragging on our economy. It slows growth. As Rogoff and Reinhart's study showed, as Secretary of Treasury Geithner acknowledged in the committee, it's already slowing our growth. And he also added it's worse than that because it puts us at risk, as Mr. Bowles and Simpson say, for some sort of debt crisis. It's unpredictable when and how it might occur. That's President Obama's Secretary of the Treasury.
The member's time has expired.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to have 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
So we can't help keep delaying. We can't keep promising to do something tomorrow. We have to have a vote. We'll have a vote today. We need to act today. A vote for the Democratic proposal is a vote to do nothing. It's a vote to stay in denial. It's a vote that says deficits don't matter. We can just keep on. But deficits do matter. They have always mattered. They always will matter. And some say you can't making any savings from reducing deficit spending. Let me show you this chart. I think the first one, because $61 billion reduction is a reduction of the baseline. And when you reduce the baseline, you save that amount every year, even if you have growth in the future years. And it adds up. It's kind of geometrical reduction in spending and debt that we have to have. And it's been working the other way. We've been increasing dramatically. And you know from your business accounting that 7% return on your money doubles your money in 10 years. We got 24% the last 2 years. That's why the government is doubling and quadrupling in size. But this would show, according to our budget staff and the calculators, If you reduce the baseline $61 billion of discretionary spending alone, it would save $862 billion in deficit reduction over 10 years. And if you were to freeze that baseline in for just 5 years, not only would you save $860 billion, but $1.65 trillion. Enough money to make a real difference in just one little act of $61 billion in reduction of discretionary spending.
The senator's
Got to
time
take that step. I thank
has
the
expired.
President and would yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, one, I would note I appreciate the senator from Alabama's help on the patent bill which passed last night, and it is one thing that will help us increase jobs and not add anything to the deficit. I do, I have to think of the revenues that come in. We had what I think was a terrible mistake when the Congress voted to support going to war in Iraq, and I was one of the 22 who voted against that war, but then voted to cut taxes and borrow the money to pay for the war in Iraq. We borrowed $1 trillion to pay for a war that has not made us safer, has created thousands of Americans' deaths and tens of thousands of others, and destroyed our ability to respond otherwise. It has accomplished one thing. Iraq did pose a threat to Iran, and we've removed that threat to Iran, which I'm sorry to say was an added mistake. We also went into Afghanistan with the intent to catch Osama bin Laden, and when they had, according to accounts, when he was surrounded, our CIA and special forces were yanked out of Afghanistan to go in Iraq, and he simply escaped into Pakistan. $1 trillion later, we're still there. Again, borrowed the money for those two wars, one that went way beyond whatever it was supposed to, the other we shouldn't have been in the first place, but we borrowed the money. And we also cut taxes on oil companies and millionaires and everybody else. Not the best way to show shared hardships for that war. It's only the brave men and women who are over there who have the hardship, not the rest of us. And this, let me talk though about how the Senate CR and H.R. 1, how that funding would affect the Department of State and Foreign Operations. These are both come under a subcommittee that I chair in appropriations. So let's talk about what's in the House CR, perhaps more importantly, what's not in the House CR. It is notable the House defines diplomacy and international development as non-security spending, even though, of course, the integral part they both play in protecting our security around the globe. It ignores the views of Secretary of State Clinton, Secretary of Defense Gates, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Admiral Mullen, former Chairman General Powell, General Petraeus, President Obama, former Presidents George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, and every former national security advisor. They've all made clear that these investments do directly protect U.S. security interests. The investments the House say are not part of security interests. Every one of these people I've named, so it directly affects our national security interests, not only in the frontline states of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, but around the world. And they're not alone. President Reagan, former Homeland Security Secretary Ridge, also recognized a direct connection between international assistance and our security. President Reagan said security assistance programs, an essential complement to our defense effort, directly enhances security of the United States. Secretary Ridge said the programs supported by the International Affairs budget are as essential to our national security as defense programs. Secretary Gates said, I never miss an opportunity to call for more funding for emphasis on diplomacy and development. There's a whole lot of other examples from both Republicans and Democratic leaders that seem to have fallen on deaf ears in the House. Our Republican friends in the House should know that we can't counter the influence of al-Qaeda and other violent extremists through military force alone. They should know that helping countries like Southern Sudan rebuild after conflict, or building stable democratic institutions in countries like Egypt, or preventing the trafficking of nuclear material and other weapons in the former Soviet Union, or educating and providing jobs for youth who would otherwise be fodder for terrorist recruiters in the Middle East, or combating the corrosive influence of organized crime in Central America, or preventing the spread of deadly viruses in Africa and Asia, viruses that are only one airplane ride away from the United States, or supporting NATO, or supporting the International Atomic Energy Agency or UN peacekeeping. These are all parts of our national security. And it's the diplomats here and abroad and the funds they administer that make it possible, to make the United States part of the world community. While the House press release claims to adequately fund operations and programs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, that's empty rhetoric. Secretary Clinton has said the House CR will unacceptably harm U.S. interests in those countries. That's only the beginning. The House CR slashes funding for refugees and other victims of disaster by 40%. At the same time, the members on the other side of the aisle are rightly urging that we help the tens of thousands of Libyans who have fled their homes. We say we should be helping these Libyans, these people who have fled their homes. We should help the Egyptians who are now refugees in Libya. And I agree with them. Everybody agrees with them. But, oh, by the way, we're going to cut almost in half your budget for refugees. You can't have one without the other. The House CR provides no funding for the Global Food Security Fund. That prevents hunger and famine in Africa and Asia and improves America's standing. It eliminates funding for the Clean Technology Fund, which supports exports of solar, wind, and other renewable energy technology. But you know what it does? Because we remove it, we remove a major competitor to China. They're funding these technologies. We have fierce competition from them. They are delighted to see us step back. And so these jobs are not going to be in technology in the United States. We're not going to be exporting this. We're not going to have influence in that part of the world. China will take over. How short-sighted can this be? This is like you own a business and you've got a competitor on the other side of town. And you say, well, you know, we're not going to advertise. We're not going to carry up-to-date goods. We're only going to be open a couple days a week. Gosh, I hope that competitor doesn't drive us out of business. It drastically reduces funding to operate our embassies and consulates, which every American traveling, working, or studying overseas depend on. Every one of us, as members of Congress, know when there's been a problem somewhere or an American has had a problem, they go to our embassies or our consulates abroad. They're not going to be there. The House CR would sharply cut funding for global health programs. HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and other deadly diseases. Denying life-saving drugs and other services to hundreds of thousands of people. And condemning women and children in other parts of the world to death. Renege on our treaty obligations to the UN, to the international financial institutions. That threatens our voting shares, which our competitors, again, particularly China, are eager to purchase. At a time when China is rapidly expanding its influence globally, the House would have us pull back and say, here, you guys take over. You can be the face, you can be the power that these countries will see, not the United States. Well, even Great Britain's conservative government slashing domestic spending left and right is exempting, even increasing, international aid because, unlike our Republican friends in the House, they recognize it's a matter of national security. You know, we might say also the impact of H.R. 1 is equally devastating our domestic programs. Our foreign programs as part of our security is devastating there, but look what it's doing here. Social safety net, the programs that maintain and expand our country's infrastructure, they're going to be slashed. And numerous economists, from Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke to Mark Zandi, recognize the impact of H.R. 1 be the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs, just at a time when our economies begin to recover. I hear this daily from my fellow Vermonters. Take, for example, the mother came into my Montpelier office a few weeks ago, explained how the Head Start program changed the direction of her life. Not only did Head Start provide a reliable, safe, educational environment for her children, it made it possible for her to pursue a college education, be a strong tax-paying part of our society. But H.R. 1 would deny more than 300 other Vermont children and families these same opportunities. For those unmoved by cuts to Head Start, they would also devastate one of our best economic development tools, the Community Development Block Grant Program.
The Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President, I ask my full statement be made part of the record, and I'd ask to continue for 30 seconds more.
Without objection.
Senate CR provides $1.68 billion for refugee assistance, which is equal to fiscal year 2010 and $662 million above provided in H.R. 1. And I have many, many other examples. We ought to listen to former Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, former Republican Secretary of State and current ones, and know the need for this. I thank the chair, and I thank my distinguished friend, the senior citizen from New Mexico, for his courtesy.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, first I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. These have been approved by the majority and the minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd ask consent to speak for up to 10 minutes, as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the damage that would be done if H.R. 1 were to become law, and specifically to talk about a few areas that I have been paying particular attention to. Science and technology, for one, particularly related to energy policy. Second, border security and law enforcement, and also education. To me, this is not a question of whether there should be cuts in our federal budget. Clearly, there should be cuts. But the real issue here is whether we should be smart about where we make those cuts. To me, it's clear that H.R. 1 does not represent smart policy about where to make those cuts. It represents a plan to mindlessly cut funding during the remaining 5 months of the current fiscal year in order to send some kind of message to the world that we are serious about deficit reduction. In my view, H.R. 1 sends a message, but it is not the right message. The message it sends is that we, in fact, are not willing to look at serious deficit reduction at this point. The first area of cuts that I wanted to talk about that are contained in H.R. 1 that will severely impact our nation for years to come and have effect on how many jobs we can actually create, that is the area of science and energy innovation. Last December, this Congress passed a reauthorization of what we call the America Competes Act. And I was very privileged to work, particularly with my colleague from Tennessee, Senator Alexander, on helping get that legislation enacted. Its purpose was to authorize funding for the Department of Energy's Office of Science, for the National Science Foundation, and for the National Institutes of Standards and Technology for the next 3 years, so that by fiscal year 2016, we would have completed a 10-year doubling of the funding for those agencies. I'd like to note that this effort was first started during the Bush administration. It has been carried forward during this current administration under President Obama, The effort has enjoyed strong bipartisan support and garnered endorsements from leading industry groups, Council on Competitiveness. These organizations recognize that the future of our nation depends on the strong scientific backbone that we need for our workforce in order to out-innovate our competitors around the world. So it comes as a surprise to me to see large cuts being proposed by the House of Representatives in their fiscal year 2011 funding bill to the very programs that all of us seemed to agree are needed to keep us competitive in the years ahead. What cuts am I talking about? Let me give an example. One example is in the Office of Science. This is the nation's largest supporter of physical sciences, and these are the very areas by which we intend to supply a new stream of scientists and engineers to companies such as Intel and Ford Motor Company and many others. The House bill proposes to cut the Office of Science budget by $1.1 billion, or 22%. The result is an estimated reduction of 4,500 full-time scientists and engineers working on basic endeavors in the area of energy science. It will terminate the early career research program for young faculty and ongoing graduate programs in the energy sciences. National user facilities that the Office of Science runs for upwards of 27,000 researchers from industry and academia will be shuttered or put into a standby status. This includes the 4 nanoscience centers across the United States that have had breakthrough discoveries to propel our industries forward in the areas of solid-state lighting and new drugs and microelectronics. Let me talk about some of the other programs impacted in the Department of Energy. The Office of Nuclear Energy. This is leading the way to a new generation of smaller, less costly reactors at places such as Oak Ridge and Idaho National Laboratories. This effort will suffer. The ability to move this bipartisan program forward will cease. In the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EER&E, as it's referred to in the department, the House bill will result in over 31,000 homes that will not be weatherized, and by July 1st, it is estimated that something like 8,000 people who are expected to perform this work will be out of jobs. The program to mix coal with biomass, this is a program that shows great promise, will be eliminated, as will programs to fund offshore wind. Let me cite some other examples of the damage that the House bill will have on other agencies in the COMPETES Act. The National Science Foundation will have reductions leading to a loss of 10,000 university researchers and graduate students. Being so late in the year, and I indicated we've got about 5 months left in this fiscal year, the effect will be to reduce the program to train teachers in math and science by 53% at a time when it is widely recognized that other nations are outperforming us in student test scores in these subjects. Mr. President, I'd like to enter into the record 2 letters, the first by the Council on Competitiveness, signed by Sam Allen, who's Chairman and CEO of the Deere Company, Mike Splinter, Chairman and CEO of Applied Materials, Chad Holliday, Chairman of the Bank of America, William Haidt, President of the United Association of Plumbers and Pipe Fitters, and Deborah Wynn Smith, the President and CEO of the Council. The letter succinctly states that, quote, scientific research and skilled workers are the basis for new ideas, new technologies, new products and services, new companies, even entirely new industries. The American economy cannot compete and grow if we neglect our capacity to innovate.
Without objection.